The spring sun, a molten coin in the vast sky, reigned over Lake Tahoe. Its golden rays, like fingers of light, stretched across the glassy surface, turning the water into a shimmering, liquid mirror. Garrett Lawson, a man weathered by time and etched with unspoken stories, sat in his old wooden boat, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The fishing line, taut and expectant, disappeared into the crystalline depths, so clear he could discern the pebbles and silt of the lakebed over 15 feet below. On the weathered dock, his son, Wyatt, all elbows and knees, lay prone, lost in the fantastical world of airplanes. A well-worn book was open before him, its pages filled with soaring machines of dreams and ambition. Around the valley, the serried ranks of pine trees stood sentinel, their evergreen boughs forming a majestic, natural cathedral. The air, still and expectant, vibrated with birdsong, their melodies echoing across the tranquil water. In that fleeting moment, a bubble of peace enveloped Garrett. The world felt manageable, safe. Then, the serene canvas of the sky was violently ripped apart. A sound, like metal being tortured, shrieked through the air, a piercing, unnatural cry that made the blood run cold. Garrett snapped his head up, his gaze drawn to the heavens. A private jet, sleek and black against the blue, was plummeting earthward at a sickening angle. A thick plume of black smoke billowed from its right engine, spiraling into a dark, accusing finger pointing at the ground. Doom! Wyatt's scream, raw and primal, shattered the calm as it echoed from the dock. The stricken aircraft hurtled towards the lake, a metallic beast on a collision course with oblivion, impacting the water less than 200 meters away. The explosion was deafening, a monstrous roar that swallowed the birdsong and ripped through the silence. A geyser of water erupted skyward, a towering column reaching dozens of meters into the air, before collapsing back into the lake with the force of a small tsunami. Waves surged towards Garrett's boat, rocking it violently, threatening to capsize the fragile vessel. "Stay on the dock, Wyatt. Don't get in the water," Garrett roared, his voice barely audible above the din. Without hesitation, he plunged into the frigid depths of the lake. The icy water, a shock to his system, stole his breath and tightened his muscles. He swam with powerful strokes, his arms churning, his focus solely on the plume of black smoke rising ominously from the crash site. The stench of jet fuel, acrid and choking, filled the air, burning his nostrils and coating his throat. As he drew closer, the grim tableau became clearer. The plane, or what was left of it, was sinking with alarming speed, disappearing into the murky depths. Garrett inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with air, and dove beneath the surface. Underwater, the world was a murky, disorienting haze. Leaking fuel formed a swirling black cloud, obscuring everything. His eyes stung, as if filled with acid. His lungs began to burn, screaming for air. But he pressed on, his hands sweeping blindly through the icy darkness, searching, hoping. Then, through the gloom, he saw it, the mangled remains of the cockpit. The door was warped and twisted, a useless barrier. The glass was shattered, jagged shards reflecting the faint, filtered light. Inside, a figure struggled weakly, a desperate fight against the inevitable. It was a woman, her arm pinned, trapped by the twisted metal of the seatbelt. Garrett swam towards her, grabbed the door frame, and pulled with all his might. The metal groaned in protest, but held fast. He pulled again, this time with both hands, bracing his foot against the fuselage for leverage, his muscles screaming in protest. With a final, desperate heave, the door gave way, tearing free with a screech of metal. His lungs were on fire, threatening to explode. His head spun, the world tilting precariously. He pushed inside, his movements frantic, and fumbled with the seatbelt, finally releasing the woman from its deadly embrace. Her hand, when he touched it, was icy cold, lifeless. There was no movement, no sign of life. Garrett wrapped his arm around her, cradling her body against his, and kicked upwards, his legs burning with exertion. When they broke the surface, the sudden sunlight was blinding, an explosion of light after the oppressive darkness. He gasped for air, dragging the woman up, gently patting her back, willing her to breathe. She coughed once, a weak, watery sound, then again. Finally, she gasped, air filling her lungs. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and frantic, locking with Garrett's. He didn't know then that she was Meredith Carlyle. He didn't know that saving her life would irrevocably alter the course of both their destinies, setting in motion a series of events that no one could have foreseen. And he certainly didn't know that this woman held the key to a painful past he had desperately tried to bury forever. But wait, who exactly is Meredith? And why did fate, in its cruel and capricious way, bring her crashing down right in front of the man who sought only to vanish from the world? The next morning, Garrett stood in his small, sun-drenched kitchen, brewing coffee in the ancient percolator that had once belonged to his father. The sunlight, filtered through the delicate lace curtains that Brooke, his late wife, had hung there 6 years before, cast soft, dancing shadows across the worn wooden table. The rustic cabin carried the comforting scent of pine and aged paper, a testament to a life lived simply. In the corner, perched on a shelf, a small, outdated television flickered with breaking news. "Last night's miraculous plane crash survival," the Chiron screamed. The screen showed aerial footage of Lake Tahoe, rescue boats circling the crash site, divers plunging into the depths, Coast Guard helicopters sweeping overhead. A headline flashed across the bottom of the screen: "Billionaire CEO survives plane crash." Garrett reached out and snapped off the television before the announcer could utter the woman's name. He didn't want to know. He didn't need to. In his experience, people labeled as heroes rarely found happy endings. They only dragged more trouble in their wake. He poured himself a cup of coffee, the rich aroma filling the small room, and glanced out the window towards the lake. The water was calm once again, still as glass, reflecting the morning sky. It was as if yesterday had never happened. No explosion, no crippled airplane tearing through the sky, no desperate rescue. But Garrett knew better. Some scars, etched deep into the soul, never truly heal. 6 years ago, he had been a senior aerospace engineer at Carlisle Aerospace, the kind of place where they developed experimental aircraft systems so cutting-edge, so classified, they didn't even have official names. Garrett had loved that work, the intricate dance of precision, logic, the way metal, mathematics, and motion intertwined to defy gravity. But he had also been the one to see what no one else wanted to acknowledge: a critical flaw in the hydraulic control system, a ticking time bomb that could detonate under high stress. Garrett wrote reports, sent emails, raised his concerns in countless meetings, his voice growing increasingly urgent. His direct supervisor had simply smiled, a dismissive, patronizing gesture, and told him not to worry. Upper management would handle it. But they didn't. 3 months later, during a test flight over the Nevada desert, that very system failed. The aircraft exploded in mid-air, a catastrophic display of fire and destruction. The pilot survived, ejected at the last possible second. But Brooke, Garrett's wife, who had been in the observation tower with the other families, had not. He still remembered the phone call, the site manager's voice trembling with shock and grief. "There's been an explosion. The observation tower collapsed. We're doing everything we can." Garrett drove 3 straight hours from headquarters to Nevada, his mind racing, his heart pounding against his ribs. The entire time he clung to a single, desperate hope. "She's fine. Brooke has to be fine. She's just waiting for me." But when he arrived, the observation tower was nothing but a pile of twisted metal and shattered concrete. The west wall, where the families had stood to watch the test flights, had been completely obliterated. The shock wave from the mid-air explosion had ripped through it in seconds. Brooke had been standing right there. Her hand had been holding Wyatt's, their 3-year-old son, who had been pointing at the sky, his eyes shining with unadulterated excitement as he watched the plane take off. She had been bending down, whispering something into his ear. Then, the explosion. Wyatt survived only because Brooke had instinctively pulled him into her arms, using her own body as a shield against the blast. The boy suffered only minor scratches, but Brooke hadn't made it. Garrett had knelt beside his wife's broken body amidst the debris, his hands trembling as he touched her face, still warm, as if she were merely sleeping. But there was no breath, no heartbeat, only the chilling stillness of death. Wyatt stood next to him, silent and uncomprehending, not crying, not speaking, just staring at his mother, his big, round eyes filled with a profound and unsettling confusion. "Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's wrong with Mom? Will she get up?" Garrett couldn't answer. He just held his son tight, held him as hard as he could, and let the tears fall, the first tears he had shed since the explosion. The next day, Garrett submitted his resignation. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. There was no severance pay, no apology, only a cold confidentiality agreement and a polite suggestion that he should move on with his life. The company offered compensation for Brooks' death, classifying it as a tragic accident, a catastrophic, unforeseeable incident. They paid for the funeral. They sent flowers. But they never admitted fault, never acknowledged their negligence. Garrett still remembered that final meeting with chilling clarity. The room was sterile, washed in the pale, unforgiving light of fluorescent bulbs. Impeccably dressed executives sat stiffly on the other side of the long, polished table. "Mr. Lawson," the HR director had said, her voice flat and devoid of emotion, as if she were reading from a script, "we understand your grief, but your continued sharing of personal views on the technical issue is negatively affecting company morale." Personal views. Garrett's voice, when he finally spoke, was raw with barely suppressed rage. "I warned you 7 times. 7. I have the data. I have the inspection reports. My wife is dead because you ignored them." The man at the head of the table, Philip Carlyle, executive vice president, offered a small, cold smile, untouched by warmth or empathy. "Mr. Lawson, we conducted a full investigation. The explosion resulted from multiple unforeseeable factors. There was no negligence on the company's part. No negligence. Garrett shot to his feet, slamming his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. "I wrote a 47-page report. I ran failure simulations. Enough." Philip raised a hand, cutting him off, his expression hardening. "You have 2 options, Mr. Lawson. 1. Sign this agreement, accept the compensation, and remain silent. 2. We will protect the company's reputation through any legal means necessary. And I assure you, you will never work in aerospace again." Garrett looked down at the stack of papers in front of him, numbers with far too many zeros, a sum painted in blood. Then, he thought of Wyatt, his 3-year-old boy, staying with the babysitter, not understanding why Mommy wasn't coming home. He needed a father. He needed someone who survived, not someone consumed by vengeance. Garrett signed, his hand shaking so violently that the signature wavered, a distorted echo of his former self. "A wise decision," Philip said, his voice devoid of any genuine sentiment, as he collected the documents. "And remember this, Mr. Lawson. This agreement is permanent. One careless comment, one social media post, one interview, and we will sue you into bankruptcy." That was the last time Garrett ever set foot in Carlisle Aerospace. He put Wyatt, not yet 3 years old, into the car and drove north, following the road until pavement became gravel, then gravel became dirt. He bought the wooden cabin with what remained of their savings. There was no internet and cell service was spotty at best, only available if he climbed halfway up the hill. There was only a wood-burning stove, a small wooden dock, and a breathtaking view of the lake stretching for miles. Garrett repaired engines for people in the area, lawnmowers, chainsaws, the occasional beat-up pickup truck. He taught Wyatt how to fish, how to read the sky for signs of wind, how to be kind, even when the world wasn't kind back. At night, after Wyatt fell asleep, Garrett sat beneath the soft glow of a lantern, turning the pages of old engineering textbooks, not because he still yearned for the work, but because he couldn't escape it. The equations, the stress calculations, the warnings he had written that no one had heeded haunted him. Hank Bowers, the owner of the general store in town, had once asked him why a man so talented would choose to live alone in the mountains, burying himself in obscurity. Garrett had only smiled and said he liked the quiet. The truth was too heavy, too painful to place on anyone's shoulders. The thin, pale scar on his wrist, a physical reminder of the compromised hydraulic system, the buried warnings, the price he had paid for simply speaking the truth, was a constant companion. Now 6 years had passed. The small wooden cabin once again echoed with the sounds of a life slowly rebuilding itself. Wyatt's laughter, the crackling of the stove, the rustling of book pages in the quiet night. It wasn't the life Garrett had dreamed of, but it was the life he had. And, for a time, it had been enough. He did not know that the woman he had pulled from the wreckage of the plane was already hunting the person responsible for her near-death experience. And he certainly did not know that her survival would unleash a chain of events that no one would be able to control. A storm that would shatter the fragile peace he had so painstakingly constructed. The roar of engines, intrusive and unwelcome, shattered the morning calm around 10 o'clock. Garrett was outside, splitting logs at the chopping block, his flannel sleeves rolled up despite the lingering chill of early spring. Inside the cabin, Wyatt was at the kitchen table, lost in the world of his airplane model. Glue and balsa wood scraps littered the surface, creating a miniature battlefield of the boy's own making. The engine noise grew louder, a deep, guttural rumble that was jarringly out of place in the tranquil mountain setting. Then, 3 sleek, black Cadillacs emerged from the pines, their polished surfaces gleaming like obsidian mirrors. Dust rose in blurred ribbons behind them, drifting through beams of sunlight, filtering through the branches of the trees. Garrett set the axe down, its weight suddenly feeling heavier than before, and wiped his hands on his jeans. His heart began to race, an involuntary response to the unsettling intrusion. The lead car stopped only a few meters from the porch. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, somewhere in her 40s. Her dark hair pulled back into a severe ponytail that accentuated her sharp, intelligent features. She wore a navy blazer and matching trousers, an outfit that probably cost more than Garrett's battered pickup truck. A faint bruise still shadowed her temple, a memento of her ordeal, and a white bandage on her jaw stood out against her pale skin. But her eyes remained strong, unwavering, radiating an unmistakable air of authority. Meredith Carlyle approached, the heels of her expensive shoes crunching rhythmically on the gravel. 2 assistants, grim-faced and professional, emerged from the cars behind her. Both wore identical black suits and carried leather folders and tablets. One clutched a thick envelope, the kind that whispered of contracts and legal agreements. Meredith stopped in front of him and extended her hand. Her handshake was firm and decisive, the kind of grip that sealed deals and ended debates. "You saved my life," she said, her voice clear and composed, betraying no hint of the trauma she had endured. "Then you disappeared before I had the chance to thank you. I wanted to do that in person." Garrett withdrew his hand slowly, his expression unreadable. "No need. I only did what anyone would do." Meredith's lips twitched, a fleeting expression that was not quite a smile. Not everyone would. Most people would pull out their phones to record and post it online before calling for help. One of the assistants stepped forward, lifting the envelope with both hands as though presenting a sacred offering. "We'd like to compensate you for your bravery," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And we also request that you sign a confidentiality agreement, standard procedure for incidents involving the company." Garrett didn't take the envelope. He glanced towards the shimmering lake beyond the pines, then looked directly into Meredith's eyes, his gaze unwavering. His voice was low but firm, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. "I don't want money, and I don't sign things like that anymore." Meredith tilted her head slightly, as if a missing piece of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. There was something in Garrett's voice, something old and deeply buried, a bitterness suppressed to the point of near invisibility. "You don't want to know why my plane went down?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for any flicker of emotion. "Not my business," Garrett replied, his tone dismissive. "It could have been sabotage. Meredith continued, her voice carefully measured, as she studied the subtle shifts in his expression. The FAA is investigating. Someone may have tampered with the hydraulic system. Garrett's jaw tightened imperceptibly for a moment, then went still again, his face a mask of carefully controlled composure. Meredith glanced towards the open doorway of the cabin. From where she stood, she could see the simple, sturdy furnishings, the neatly stacked firewood beside the stove, a faded photograph on the wall depicting a smiling woman holding a young child, and next to it, pinned to a corkboard, were technical diagrams, detailed schematics, drawn with clean, precise lines, correct symbols, exact measurements, neat handwriting. She stepped closer, narrowing her eyes at the nearest corner of the blueprint. The logo, small but unmistakable, was that of Carlisle Aerospace. Meredith's breath caught in her throat. She turned back to Garrett, her eyes now filled with a mixture of suspicion and understanding. His face was as calm as the still surface of the lake, but his shoulders betrayed the tension he carried beneath the surface. They stood there in silence, the air thick with unspoken words, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Wyatt peeked out from the doorway, his eyes wide with curiosity, clutching his airplane model tightly in his hands. "Dad, who are they?" Garrett's expression softened instantly, the hard lines of his face dissolving into a warm, familiar smile. "Just passing visitors, son. Go back inside." Wyatt nodded and retreated back into the cabin. Meredith watched the door close, then turned back to Garrett. Something had shifted in her gaze, perhaps recognition, perhaps empathy, perhaps a dawning understanding of the events that had shaped his life. She gave a small, slow nod, as if a crucial piece of information had finally clicked into place. "Thank you again, Mr. Lawson," she said, addressing him by name for the first time. "If you ever need anything, you know how to find me." She didn't wait for his response. She turned and walked back to the car, her head held high, her movements purposeful. The 3 black Cadillacs reversed down the narrow road, their engines humming like the ominous breathing of some large, predatory creature. Then, they vanished behind the pines as quickly and quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind only a lingering trail of dust. Wyatt stepped onto the porch, watching the fading cloud of dust with childish curiosity. "Dad, why did she come all the way out here just to say thank you?" Garrett watched the dust settle, his eyes troubled. "She's from another world, Wyatt, not ours." But even as he spoke the words, he knew that things were no longer simple, that the sanctuary he had so carefully built was about to be shattered. By late afternoon, the story had spread throughout the valley, then far beyond its quiet borders. But it wasn't the simple version of a man saving a life and disappearing. It was the distorted, sensationalized version, the one that sold more ads and fueled the insatiable hunger for gossip. Someone had leaked the video of the crash, a blurry clip recorded on the phone of a hiker on the mountainside, someone who had happened to raise their phone at the precise moment the plane went down. The grainy footage showed the impact, the column of water exploding skyward like a plume of white fireworks, and a tiny, almost imperceptible figure swimming towards the wreckage. Within hours, the video had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across the internet. News outlets clawed at it, desperate for a piece of the story. Bloggers analyzed every frame, dissecting the footage for hidden meanings and potential conspiracies. And then, the venomous headlines began to appear, each more poisonous and inflammatory than the last. Hero or mastermind, suspicious proximity in CEO rescue, billionaire crash. Was she lured to a remote lake? The reclusive mountain man. What is he hiding? They spun bizarre narratives, weaving tales of intrigue and suspicion. A man living alone in the woods, with no verifiable employment records and no digital footprint. A woman crashing right onto his doorstep, too convenient in their eyes. The valley that had been Garrett's refuge for 6 long years was suddenly transformed, overnight, into a sprung trap. Reporters poured in by midday, renting rooms at the town motel, lining the main road with news vans, knocking on doors, clamoring for quotes and glimpses of the mysterious mountain man. Hank's general store quickly became the epicenter of the media frenzy. Cameras were set up outside, capturing every customer who dared to enter. Journalists bought coffee just to ask every local resident whether they knew who Garrett Lawson really was, whether they had any insight into his motives or his past. Hank, overwhelmed and distraught, called Garrett around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. His voice was filled with confusion and guilt. "Garrett, I'm so sorry. They're saying awful things. And people are starting to believe them." Garrett thanked him, his voice calm and reassuring, then hung up. There was nothing left to say. At the small garage where he worked part-time, Ron Atwood, the only person who had ever given him a job when no one else would, pulled him aside near the end of the day, his face etched with concern. Ron's eyes were sincere, yet firm. "Garrett, I don't buy into any of those rumors, but the customers are getting uneasy. I think it's best if you take some time off, until things settle down." Garrett didn't argue. He only packed his tools into his toolbox with deliberate care, the motions ingrained in him from thousands of repetitions. His hands were steady, but his jaw was tight, a muscle twitching betraying the turmoil within. Then, he walked out to his truck and drove away, leaving behind the only semblance of normalcy he had managed to salvage. That evening, when he stopped to buy bread and milk for Wyatt at the local market, Garrett felt the weight of countless eyes following his every move. He could hear the whispers trailing behind him like shadows, seeping through every aisle. A woman pushing a shopping cart clutched her daughter closer to her side the moment he walked past, as though he were a threat, a dangerous predator lurking in the aisles. Near the checkout, a man in a worn work jacket said loudly to his friend, his voice dripping with suspicion, "No one just happens to be there when a billionaire's plane crashes. He must have planned the whole thing." Garrett set his basket down on the counter and walked out of the store, empty-handed, the weight of the accusations crushing him. That night, rain hammered steadily against the cabin roof, a relentless drumming that echoed the turmoil in his soul. The sound was rhythmic and mournful, like a dirge played on an ancient drum. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, listlessly poking at his dinner, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed from unshed tears. "Dad, why are people saying you're bad?" Garrett looked at his son in silence, his heart aching. Wyatt had lost his mother before he could even remember her face, before he could fully grasp the enormity of his loss. He had never asked for anything except a peaceful life, and now, even that was beginning to crumble, threatened by forces beyond his control. Garrett wanted to explain that the world often preferred entertaining lies over boring truths, that people believed what they wanted to believe because it was easier than engaging in critical thought. But he couldn't burden a child with such cynicism. He simply reached across the table and took his son's small hand in his. "Sometimes people are afraid of things they don't understand, son. This will pass." Wyatt looked down at his plate, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will it really pass, Dad?" Garrett didn't answer. He couldn't promise something that he himself didn't believe. He cleared the table, turned off the kitchen light. The room plunged into darkness, leaving only the sound of the relentless rain, the soft, even breaths of his son, and the oppressive feeling of a world outside, slowly turning its back on him. But the thing that hurt him most wasn't the inflammatory headlines. It wasn't the hateful whispers. It was Wyatt's eyes, the eyes of a child, looking at the father he loved with a mixture of confusion and fear, unable to understand why the man who had taught him kindness, honesty, and the importance of doing the right thing was being treated like a criminal. That night, Garrett lay in bed, staring up at the darkened ceiling, feeling the old scar on his wrist burning with a familiar intensity. History was repeating itself, a cruel and relentless cycle. Once again he had done the right thing, and once again he was being punished for it. Miles away, in her opulent office at Carlisle Aerospace, Meredith sat motionless before the glowing screen of her computer. The radar log of her ill-fated flight was displayed before her, and there it was, a glaring gap, a section deliberately excised, a clear indication of malicious intent. Someone had wanted her dead, and they had gone to great lengths to make it happen. The Carlisle Aerospace Tower, a monument to ambition and innovation, rose 40 stories into the San Francisco sky. Its sleek glass and steel facade reflected the gray, Overcast heavens like a funeral shroud draped over the city. Meredith's office, perched atop the tower, was a minimalist, coldly elegant space where every line was clean and precise, where order reigned supreme. Leather chairs, a desk of reclaimed wood, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Puget Sound. The water was inky black, restless beneath the heavy clouds, mirroring the storm raging within her. But tonight, that space, usually a sanctuary of power and control, felt like a gilded cage, trapping her within its sterile confines. Meredith sat alone, the city lights reflecting faintly on the glass, turning the windows into dark, accusing mirrors. The soft hum of her computer was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. With a deliberate movement, she opened the personnel database, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She paused for a long, agonizing second before typing the name that she had been desperately trying to avoid since morning, the name that haunted her waking thoughts. Garrett Lawson. The file loaded with agonizing slowness, each passing second amplifying her growing sense of dread. Then, the lines of information appeared on the screen, each entry as cold and impersonal as ink on ice. Employment terminated following incident review. Not eligible for rehire. Meredith clicked deeper, navigating through layers of digital bureaucracy. An HR report, a technical memo, a chain of emails. She read each document line by line, her breath catching in her throat, her face growing paler with each passing word. Garrett had warned them, not once, not twice, but 7 times, 7 separate messages detailing the same critical flaw in the hydraulic control system. He had marked them as high priority, sent them to his supervisor, then higher up the chain of command all the way to the executive vice president, her uncle Philip Carlyle. And each time he had received the same dismissive response. We will review this. The issue is under evaluation. But they had not reviewed it. They had not evaluated it. They had ignored it. 3 months later, the Nevada test flight, the catastrophic explosion. 1 fatality recorded in the official report. Civilian observer, name redacted for privacy. Meredith opened the attached incident file, her heart pounding in her chest, and the name appeared on the screen like a cruel, unforgiving blade. Brooke Lawson, wife of Garrett Lawson, leaving behind a husband and a child. Meredith's hands trembled violently. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the screen as if it had suddenly burst into flames. The man who had saved her life was the man who had lost everything because of her company, because of her family, because of their negligence and their callous disregard for human life. A knock on the door made her jolt, snapping her out of her stunned reverie. Philip Carlyle, her uncle and mentor, walked into the office as he always did, without waiting for an invitation, his presence radiating an aura of power and authority. 62 years old, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a navy-tailored suit that fit the image of a man who had dominated boardrooms for 3 decades. Philip smiled, a practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Working late again, Meredith? She forced her voice into a semblance of normality, carefully masking the turmoil she felt. Just tracking the investigation progress on the crash. It's time-consuming. Philip walked to the window, placing his hands in his pockets, and looked down at the city spread out below him. I heard you went to the valley yourself to meet the man who saved you. Meredith carefully chose her words. You pulled me from the wreckage. I wanted to thank you in person. I felt it was the right thing to do. Of course, Philip replied breezily, still facing away. But be careful, Meredith. People are already weaving narratives. The more chaos, the greater the opportunity for those who benefit from it. Meredith forced herself to remain calm, suppressing her unease. He did nothing wrong. He saved my life. Philip turned, his gaze as piercing as glacial ice. I believe that, but perception is paramount, Meredith. You, of all people, should understand that. He strolled towards the door, his hand resting on the handle. Then, as an afterthought, he paused. Oh, and I trust you're not delving into old personnel files? We have far more pressing matters demanding our attention. The words, though softly spoken, carried the sharpness of a honed blade. Meredith's heart hammered against her ribs, yet her expression remained utterly composed. "Why would I do that?" she asked, her voice so steady it surprised even her. Philip smiled again, a chillingly insincere gesture. "No reason at all. I simply wouldn't want you distracted by ghosts." With that, he exited, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Meredith waited until his footsteps had faded completely. Then, with deliberate movements, she reopened the personnel files, printed every document, stacked them neatly, and tucked them into her bag. A thin drizzle greeted her as she left the building, her mind awhirl. The man who had saved her life had been systematically destroyed by her own company, by her own family. Now, she stood at a crossroads, faced with an agonizing choice. Bury the truth, protecting her family's empire, or expose it, shattering the Carlyle legacy from within. As she slid into the driver's seat, watching raindrops splatter against the windshield like tiny needles, a more immediate, chilling thought took root. If Philip suspected her investigation, if he knew what she had unearthed, she would become the next target. Meredith started the engine. Headlights sliced through the silvery gray rain. As she drove home, she found herself compulsively checking the rearview mirror every few minutes. Perhaps it was paranoia, an overreaction fueled by recent trauma. But a recent survivor of a plane crash understood, better than anyone, that sometimes paranoia was the only thing keeping you alive. The call came at 9:43 p.m. Garrett's old flip phone, a relic he kept charged more out of habit than necessity, vibrated on the kitchen table. He almost ignored it, but an inexplicable impulse made him answer. "Mr. Lawson?" A low, calm, professional voice echoed through the speaker. "This is Meredith Carlyle." Garrett's grip tightened on the phone. "How did you get this number?" "I have resources," Meredith replied, her tone unwavering. "I need to meet you tonight. There's something important I found in your file." "I don't think that's a good idea." "The press." "I know they're watching me," Meredith cut in. "And I suspect someone wants to silence you. I'm already on my way." "You don't need to." A sudden thud from Wyatt's room cut her off. "Hold on," Garrett said, and dropped the phone onto the table. Wyatt was sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching his chest, his face ashen and slick with sweat. His mouth gaped open, desperately trying to pull air into his lungs, but each breath was shallow, ragged, and weak. Garrett frantically grabbed the inhaler from the bedside table, shook it, and pressed it to his son's lips. Nothing. The inhaler was empty. He tore open the bathroom cabinet, his movements clumsy with panic. The spare inhaler wasn't there either. Wyatt was gasping, his lips tinged with blue, his fingers cold as ice. Panic seized Garrett's throat, choking off his ability to think clearly. He scooped Wyatt into his arms and stumbled toward the door. But before he could reach it, headlights flooded the yard in a harsh, blinding glare. A black Cadillac screeched to a halt on the porch. Meredith stepped out, her face etched with urgency, as if she had been anticipating this very moment. "Get in, now." Garrett had no choice. He dove into the back seat, cradling Wyatt tightly against his chest. Meredith slid into the driver's seat and slammed her foot on the accelerator. The car shot down the dirt road, headlights cutting a swathe through the inky darkness. Wyatt's breathing grew fainter with each passing second. Garrett held his son close, his voice cracking with fear. "Stay with me, Wyatt. Stay with me." The drive, which usually took 40 minutes, Meredith compressed into 25. The ER doors burst open, and nurses rushed out with a gurney. Garrett carefully laid Wyatt down, his hands trembling so violently he barely recognized them as his own. A doctor in green scrubs took charge immediately, connecting the boy to a nebulizer. Within seconds, Wyatt's chest began to rise and fall with more regularity. Garrett collapsed into a plastic chair in the hallway, burying his face in his hands, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Meredith stood a few steps away, her coat soaked with rain, her hair plastered against her cheek. She remained silent, a watchful presence in the chaos. An hour passed. Finally, a doctor emerged. Dr. Jonathan Reeves, his name tag read, wore an exhausted but relieved expression. He's stable. We'll keep him overnight for observation, but he's going to make a full recovery. Garrett exhaled, a sound that was part laugh, part sob. He rushed into the room and sat beside his son's bed. Wyatt lay on his side, his eyes half closed beneath the soft haze of the oxygen mask. "Dad," the boy whispered, his voice weak and frail. "I'm here, buddy. I'm right here with you." Wyatt closed his eyes again. His voice was barely audible, like a gentle breeze. "The pretty lady, is she an angel?" Garrett let out a watery laugh, tears streaming down his face. "Maybe, son. Maybe she is." Meredith appeared in the doorway. Garrett looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed, wet, and overflowing with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice still trembling. "If it weren't for you, I would have lost him." Meredith stepped into the room, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "You don't have to face this alone. Not anymore." Garrett reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small USB drive, and placed it in her hand. "Everything I saved, the warnings, the emails, the evidence, everything from 6 years ago, is all in here." Meredith stared at the USB, her fingers closing around the cold metal. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you're the only one who can do something about it." Meredith inhaled deeply, slowly. "Then I will. Promise." But as she tightened her grip on the USB, another thought wormed its way into her mind, cold as the night wind seeping through the hospital window. Why had Wyatt had an asthma attack tonight of all nights? Why was the inhaler empty? And why did Meredith have the unsettling feeling that something had been meticulously arranged? She looked at Garrett, a man who had once again teetered on the edge of life and death, and a chilling possibility surfaced. Was someone deliberately trying to harm him? Was someone trying to silence him permanently? And were they starting by targeting the thing he loved most in the world? Meredith glanced down at the USB in her hand. If that was true, then whoever was responsible was still out there, and they were far from finished. The small, discreet, unmarked conference room sat tucked away inside a law office on the edge of downtown San Francisco. Meredith sat at one end of the long mahogany table, Garrett at the other, the space between them thick with unspoken anxieties. Between them, Dr. Fiona Mallister, an independent forensic engineer, plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The ceiling projector hummed to life, and the screen flickered before illuminating with a stark white light. The files appeared one by one, emails with blazing red subject lines screaming, "Urgent hydraulic system evaluation required. Safety concerns," and no response. Scanned pages of handwritten notes, barely legible in places. Technical schematics covered in red ink annotations, highlighting critical flaws. Photos of cracked metal components, their surfaces revealing the telltale signs of stress and fatigue. Test data showing failure rates far exceeding acceptable thresholds. Dr. Mallister read each document with meticulous care, her expression growing progressively darker with each piece of evidence. She opened one email Garrett had sent to a supervisor, the words stark and uncompromising. "Hydraulic control system exhibits catastrophic failure potential under continuous load. Recommend immediate grounding of all units until redesign." 3 days later, the response contained only one line, devoid of any urgency or concern. "Concern noted. Continue production." Dr. Mallister clicked into another file, a technical memo from the chief engineer to the executive board, its contents carefully crafted to minimize the severity of the situation. Minor technical issue flagged by junior engineer. Recall costs estimated at $2.3 billion. Recommend internal review. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the screen. After several seconds of heavy silence, she said, "This is undeniable, incriminating evidence. The person who approved these systems knew they were unstable, knew human lives were at risk." Meredith's voice dropped, barely a whisper. "Who signed off on it?" Dr. Mallister opened the scanned approval form. At the bottom of the page, a familiar signature stood out in stark relief, scrawled in confident blue ink. "Philip Carlyle." The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the projector. Garrett leaned back in his chair, his face an unreadable mask, as though every emotion had been locked away behind those steady, unwavering eyes. Meredith stared at the screen, her hand resting on the table, her fingers rigid. Dr. Lister spoke again, her voice flat and clinical. He approved it to avoid a recall. A recall would have cost the company billions, so he buried the reports and continued production. She turned to Garrett, her expression filled with a mixture of sympathy and respect. He blamed the pilot, and when that wasn't enough, he made sure the man who warned them could warn no one else. Garrett's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, no longer anger, just a weary acceptance of the truth. They fired me the day after the explosion, threatened to ruin me if I ever spoke a word, said I'd never work in aerospace again. Meredith rose abruptly and walked to the window. Rain left long streaks across the cold glass, distorting the city lights into blurry halos. If I make this public, she said slowly, her voice barely audible above the drumming of the rain, the company will collapse. Thousands will lose their jobs. My family's reputation will be destroyed forever. Garrett looked at her, his expression calm and resolute. And if you don't, he said, more people will die. She turned around, their eyes met. One pair carrying the weight of years of loss, the other filled with the heavy burden of conscience. A second later, Meredith nodded, a single, decisive movement. Then I know what I have to do. Dr. Lister shut the laptop and closed the lid with a soft thud. I'll prepare the full technical report. It will hold up in court before the FAA, before any agency. Meredith thanked her, then left the office with Garrett. They walked into the parking lot, the rain pattering steadily on the roof above. Garrett spoke first, his voice hesitant. You don't have to do this. You could bury it. Protect yourself. Meredith looked at him through the curtain of rain, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. I could, she said. But if I did, I'd be no different from him. She paused, her gaze fixed on some distant point. The truth always resurfaces, like that plane in the lake. It may sink, but it doesn't disappear. Garrett almost laughed, a weary, sincere sound that came from deep within his chest. No, it doesn't. Meredith stepped into her car. Before starting the engine, she lowered the window, letting the cool rain wash over her face. I'll need you to testify when all of this comes to light. I will, Garrett said, his voice firm. Meredith nodded, then drove off into the rain. Garrett remained in the parking lot, watching the taillights fade into the watery darkness. For the first time in 6 years, he felt the tightness in his chest begin to loosen. A weight had been lifted, not entirely, but enough for him to breathe a little easier. The truth was finally going to be spoken, and this time someone was finally listening. The emergency board meeting was convened at 8 a.m. on Thursday. When Meredith walked in, the 40th floor conference room was already packed, a tense tableau of power and anxiety. Immaculately tailored executives sat around the gleaming, oversized table, their faces etched with concern. Tablets glowed with an unsettling light. Coffee steamed in delicate ceramic cups, its aroma doing little to dispel the palpable tension. Lawyers lined the walls, silent sentinels clutching documents to their chests. Philip Carlyle sat at the head of the table, his posture ramrod straight, his expression composed, his fingers interlaced. Morning sunlight streamed through the wall of windows behind him, casting a cold, almost metallic sheen across his shoulders. Meredith entered last, carrying a slim leather folder and a tablet. Deliberately, she did not take a seat. The entire room turned toward her at once, every gaze laser-focused on her. Philip smiled, a gesture as soft as a caress, but as sharp as thorns. Meredith, good. Let's keep this brief. We need to address the media response and shape our messaging. I agree, Meredith said, her voice ringing with a quiet authority. She stepped straight to the front of the room and connected her tablet to the wall screen. The screen flickered, then displayed an email. Date, time, 6 years and 4 months ago. A headline in bold, stark letters, Hydraulic failure risk. Immediate action required. Sender, Garrett Lawson. The room seemed to vibrate with a collective intake of breath. Whispers slashed through the air, like knives cutting through silk. Philip's smile faltered, then vanished entirely, leaving his face a mask of controlled fury. Meredith switched to the next slide. A photograph of a hydraulic component split wide open, the metal fractured and torn. Then another email, this time from Philip himself. The words, stark and damning, "Bury this. We're not recalling 50 aircraft over a minor flaw. Production continues." She left the words exactly as they were, without commentary, without embellishment, allowing the unvarnished truth to speak for itself. A board member shot to his feet, his face draining of color. If these documents are authentic, they are entirely authentic, Meredith said, her voice precise and unwavering. She clicked again. A scanned approval form appeared on the screen. Philip's familiar blue ink signature sat on the last line, a testament to his culpability. The Nevada test flight incident report appeared, its details meticulously documented. One civilian fatality, Brooke Lawson. Another board member rose, his face ashen. He closed his folder with a snap and hurried out of the room. Then a second followed, then a third. In less than 2 minutes, half the room was empty, the sound of their hasty retreat echoing in the sudden silence. Philip slammed his hand on the table, the impact cracking through the room like a thunderclap. "What do you think you're doing, Meredith? Are you trying to destroy this company? Destroy everything your father spent his life building?" Meredith turned to face him, her gaze unwavering, her voice steady. "No, Uncle Philip. You destroyed it the day you chose money over human lives." She set the leather folder in front of him, the weight of its contents heavy with consequence. "I resign as CEO, effective immediately. I've contacted the FAA. They will be launching a full investigation. You'll be hearing from them soon." Philip's face flushed crimson, his voice almost strangled between his teeth. "You think you're a hero? You think this makes you better than me?" Meredith spoke softly, each word a honed blade. "I'm not trying to be a hero. I'm just choosing what's right." She turned and walked out, leaving the stunned silence behind her. As she reached the door, the room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraping, voices shouting, phones ringing. But Meredith didn't look back. She pushed through the glass doors leading to the plaza outside, stepping into a maelstrom of flashing cameras and shouted questions. Reporters had gathered in a dense crowd, their faces eager, their microphones thrust forward. One reporter lunged forward first, his voice urgent. "Miss Carlyle, is it true you're accusing your own uncle of sabotage and concealing safety information?" Meredith stopped on the first step, her posture unwavering. "I'm not accusing anyone," she said clearly, her voice carrying through the din. "The evidence speaks for itself, and I will fully cooperate with all investigations related to safety at Carlyle Aerospace, past and present." Another reporter pushed forward, his voice insistent. "What about Philip Carlyle? Do you believe he should be held responsible?" "That's for the authorities to decide," Meredith replied. "I've given them everything they need." She descended the steps and walked toward her car, her pace steady, her resolve unshaken. Inside, her hands were still trembling slightly, but she managed to start the engine with a steady hand and drive away, leaving the frenzy behind her. At the small cabin by the lake, Garrett sat on the porch, his laptop resting on his lap, his gaze fixed on the screen. The headline crawling across the news ticker read, "CEO exposes family cover-up in deadly aircraft scandal." He closed the laptop with a soft click, a profound sense of closure washing over him. A breeze drifted up from the lake, carrying the scent of pine and water. The sky was slowly clearing, the last vestiges of the storm retreating into the distance. The front door swung open, and Wyatt ran out onto the porch, holding the model airplane he had just finished assembling, its silver wings gleaming in the afternoon light. "Dad, I finished it. Look." Garrett lifted his son into his arms, his heart swelling with pride. "It's perfect, Wyatt." The boy looked up at him, his eyes shining with hope and a hint of trepidation. Dad, do you think I can be an engineer like you someday? For a moment, Garrett's throat tightened, choked with a complex mix of emotions. He thought of Brooke, her vibrant spirit extinguished too soon. He thought of the years swallowed by silence, the opportunities lost, the dreams deferred. And he thought of this moment, this possible new future, built on truth and accountability. He lowered his forehead to his son's, his voice thick with emotion. You can be anything you want to be, he said, and I'll be here every step of the way. 2 days later, Meredith drove back into the valley, the landscape softened by the gentle spring rain. No escort, no glossy Cadillacs, just a rental sedan and a grocery bag on the passenger seat. She parked beside Garrett's old pickup truck and knocked on the door. Wyatt opened it first, his eyes lighting up with uncontainable joy. You came back. Meredith crouched down, smiling warmly. I promised, didn't I? Garrett appeared behind his son, surprise flickering across his face, quickly replaced by a guarded curiosity. I didn't think you'd actually come. I'm not here as a CEO, Meredith said, her voice soft but sincere. I'm here as someone who owes you more than I can ever repay. I brought dinner, if that's all right. Garrett stepped aside, his expression softening. Come in. Dinner unfolded in the small, cozy kitchen, the air filled with the aroma of garlic and simmering tomatoes, pasta with marinara sauce, garlic bread, and a big bowl of salad. Wyatt excitedly talked about his model airplanes, showing off every meticulously crafted part, his enthusiasm infectious. Meredith listened intently, asking questions with genuine interest, as if this was the most important part of her day, her presence filling the small space with warmth and laughter. When Wyatt had finally gone to bed, exhausted from the day's adventures, Garrett and Meredith sat on the porch, each with a steaming cup of coffee. The sky was crowded with stars, their light casting a soft glow on the surrounding landscape. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant hoot of an owl. Garrett spoke first, his voice low and hesitant. I lost faith in people a long time ago, after Brooke died, after they fired me. I believed that doing the right thing only gets you crushed. Meredith looked over at him, her gaze filled with empathy. And now? Now, he replied slowly, his voice tinged with a newfound hope. I think maybe it still matters, because of what you did. You risked everything, your career, your reputation, your family. Not many people would. Meredith shook her head gently. I only did what you did before me. If anyone deserves the word brave, it's you. I just listened. She paused, her eyes drifting toward the lake, her thoughts far away. I can't stop thinking about Brooke, a woman I never met, yet her death, I share a piece of that responsibility. I can't undo it, but I can make sure it never happens again to anyone. Garrett's voice softened, filled with understanding. You already have. Meredith stood to leave, the silence between them heavy with unspoken emotions. At the door, she turned back, her hand resting on the weathered wood. There's an open position at Carlisle Aerospace, head of safety and compliance. It's not glamorous, but it's critical. And I don't think anyone is more qualified than you. Garrett stiffened, his initial surprise giving way to a deep-seated unease. I'm not sure I'm ready to step back into that world again. You don't have to decide today, Meredith said, her voice gentle. Just think about it. She stepped onto the porch and was about to leave when Garrett called out her name. Meredith, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She turned back, her expression questioning. You gave my wife justice, Garrett said, his voice catching in his throat. Thank you. Meredith's eyes shimmered, though she didn't allow a single tear to fall. She simply nodded, acknowledging the depth of his gratitude, then turned and drove off into the night, leaving Garrett alone with his thoughts. He stood on the porch for a long time, watching her headlights fade into the darkness, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. For the first time in 6 years, his chest felt lighter, the weight of grief and injustice finally beginning to ease its grip. The next morning, a familiar engine sound echoed through the valley, its rumble carrying a different kind of weight, a promise of change. 3 Cadillacs returned, but this time they didn't bring power, intimidation, or threats. They brought something else entirely. Hope. Meredith stepped out of the lead car, wearing jeans and a simple sweater, her demeanor relaxed and approachable. No proud CEO, just a person trying to do the right thing, her actions speaking louder than any title. Wyatt ran over to her, beaming with excitement, his earlier trepidation replaced with unadulterated joy. "Did you bring books for me?" "I did." Meredith laughed, her eyes sparkling with genuine affection. "And something else." She handed Garrett a folder, its cover plain and unassuming. Inside was a contract, the details laid out in clear, concise language. Position, consultant safety advisor. Flexible hours, good pay. And on the last page, printed in bold, underlined letters, all safety recommendations from this position must be implemented without executive override. Full authority over safety decisions. Garrett looked up, stunned, his voice barely a whisper. "You're serious? Completely?" Meredith nodded, her expression unwavering. "The company needs someone unafraid of the truth, someone who has already proven they'll fight for what's right." "That's you, Garrett." Wyatt tugged on his dad's sleeve, his eyes wide with anticipation. "Dad, you should do it. You're good at fixing things, and maybe it's time we stopped hiding." Garrett's throat tightened, his emotions warring within him. He looked at Meredith, searching her eyes for any hint of doubt or reservation. "I'm not good at politics or boardrooms." "Good." Meredith smiled, her expression softening. "I don't need a politician. I need an engineer, someone who sees what others don't." Garrett took a long, deep breath, the scent of pine and lake air filling his lungs. "All right, I'll do it." Meredith's smile was soft but bright, radiating a warmth that chased away the lingering shadows. The 3 of them walked toward the lake, the water shimmering under the morning sun. Meredith stood at the edge, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "This is where everything began," she said softly, her voice tinged with a quiet emotion. "Where you pulled me out." Garrett stood beside her, his gaze distant, his thoughts lost in the memories of the past. "And where you pulled me out of the dark." Wyatt picked up a smooth, flat pebble and tossed it into the water, his arm arcing gracefully through the air. Ripples spread outward in widening rings, disturbing the still surface. "Do people really change?" he asked, his voice filled with innocent curiosity. Meredith looked at Garrett, then back at Wyatt, her expression thoughtful. "I think they can try, and sometimes that's enough." A gentle breeze brushed across the water, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the sound of distant birdsong. Sunlight broke through the clouds, scattering gold across the ripples, illuminating the path forward. Meredith turned to Garrett, her voice soft but steady. "You pulled me out of the lake, Garrett. Now, I'm pulling you out of the dark." Garrett let out a quiet laugh, a sound filled with relief and gratitude. "I guess we're even now." "Not yet," she said with a small, knowing smile. "But this is a beginning." A year later, the inauguration of the Carlisle Safety Foundation was held inside the newly completed headquarters. The building was smaller than the old glass tower, more compact, more humble, built from recycled wood and natural stone, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded every corner with natural light. Inside, a diverse crowd had gathered. Engineers, aviation safety advocates, families of past crash victims, whistleblowers once silenced by fear, aerospace students eager to learn, and reporters with cameras ready to capture the moment. Meredith stood at the podium, her hair falling naturally over her shoulders, a sharply tailored blazer framing her slender posture. She looked out at the crowd, her expression steady and confident, though her eyes carried a trace of the emotion that had fueled her journey. "1 year ago," she began, her voice low but resonant, filling the room with its quiet strength, "I nearly lost my life, not because of bad luck or the will of the universe, but because people in power chose profit over safety, silence over the truth." She paused, letting her words settle in the hearts and minds of those present. "But one man chose differently. 6 years ago, Garrett Lawson warned my company about a deadly flaw in the hydraulic system. He did everything right. And because of that, he lost his job, his reputation, and his wife, who died in the very crash he tried to prevent. Meredith's gaze shifted toward the front row, where Garrett sat beside Wyatt, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. He gave her the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement of her words. "This foundation exists because of people like him," she continued, her voice filled with respect and admiration. "People who refuse to stay silent, people who still believe doing the right thing matters, even when it costs them everything." The room rose to its feet in a spontaneous and overwhelming display of support. Applause thundered through the hall, echoing the sentiment that resonated in every heart. Behind her, the screen displayed a series of headlines, chronicling the events of the past year. Philip Carlyle charged with 12 counts of corporate negligence. Carlyle Aerospace forms independent ethics committee. Families of victims praise unprecedented transparency. Meredith stepped off the stage, her mission far from over, but her course firmly set. Garrett met her at the stairs, his eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she corrected, her voice firm but gentle. The reception lasted another 2 hours, a celebration of truth, accountability, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Garrett spoke with engineers who had once been silenced, sharing his story and offering them encouragement to speak up. They shook his hand, thanked him for his courage, and told him that he had given them the strength to fight for what was right. By late afternoon, the three of them drove back toward Lake Tahoe, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and gold. Garrett pushed his old wooden boat onto the water, the familiar creaks and groans a comforting reminder of simpler times. Wyatt brought along the model airplane he'd spent months assembling, its wings sleek and silver, its design a testament to his growing skill and passion. "It seems so perfect," he said, holding the airplane gently in his hands, his eyes filled with pride. They were like dreams carved into plastic, the embodiment of hope and possibility. He set it gently on the surface of the lake, the water still and calm. At first, it wobbled precariously, threatening to capsize. Then, a gentle breeze nudged it forward, and the airplane began to glide smoothly across the surface, its reflection shimmering in the water, a silent symbol of resilience and grace. Meredith stood at the shore, her hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching quietly, her heart filled with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. "You know," she said without taking her eyes off the lake, her voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of the waves. "I used to think power was control, holding all the reins, making all the decisions. And now?" Garrett asked, turning to face her, his expression filled with curiosity. "Now I think power is knowing when to let go, when to trust someone else to do the right thing, when to empower others to take the lead." Wyatt ran over, his shoes soaked, his face flushed with happiness. Garrett pulled him close, wrapping his arm protectively around his son's shoulders. The three of them stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun, watching the lake as the colors deepened, transforming from gold to amber to a warm honey hue, slowly melting into the horizon. Meredith spoke softly, almost only for the two of them to hear, her words carrying the weight of experience and the wisdom of a life transformed. "Sometimes the most precious thing isn't being saved. It's being forgiven." Garrett looked at her, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "You don't need forgiveness, Meredith. You did what was right." She smiled, a small, knowing gesture that spoke volumes about the journey they had shared. She only nodded, then turned back to the lake, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight were disappearing. "Sometimes the most precious thing isn't being saved. It's being forgiven." Garrett looked at her. "You don't need forgiveness." She turned to him with a gentle smile. She'd needed a reservoir of courage, and somehow, impossibly, she'd unearthed it. A subtle smile graced Meredith's lips, a delicate bloom after a long winter. The ghosts of the past hadn't vanished. Their spectral fingers still traced the edges of her present. The weight of those losses remained, a familiar ache. But, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, The future shimmered with possibility, a horizon no longer obscured by smoke and regret. In his new, meticulously organized office at Carroll Aerospace, Garrett sat, the afternoon sun warming his back. Through the expansive window, the city sprawled, a tapestry of concrete and dreams. The shelves behind him were lined with the totems of his profession. Weighty technical books, dog-eared and well-loved. A snapshot of Wyatt, beaming, clutching his model airplane, a testament to shared passions. And another of Brooke, forever preserved in the golden light of a summer's day, her smile a beacon against the encroaching darkness. On his desk, an open file lay waiting, the crisp white pages filled with a proposal for improved safety protocols. Small, incremental changes, perhaps, but each one a potential shield against tragedy, a chance to rewrite the past. This time, however, the air was different. This time, no one dismissed his concerns. No bean counter overruled his judgment. The suffocating hand of corporate greed no longer silenced him. He was free. His phone vibrated, a small, insistent pulse against the polished wood of his desk. A text from Wyatt. Dad, I got an A in science. My teacher says I could be an engineer just like you. Garrett's heart swelled, a familiar ache of pride and love. He quickly typed back, "That's amazing, son. I'm so proud of you. I'll be home soon." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and gazed out at the San Francisco Bay. The water danced with reflected sunlight, each ripple a tiny spark of hope. 6 years ago, he had been convinced that his life was irrevocably broken, that doing the right thing was a fool's errand, a path paved with loss and regret. He had been profoundly, blessedly wrong. Truth, he realized, had a weight and power all its own. And sometimes, against all odds, it triumphed. The lake lay still and reflective under the deepening twilight, its surface a mirror to the vast, star-dusted sky. The air was crisp and clean, the silence broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Across the water, the lights of distant homes blurred into a continuous ribbon of hope, unwavering, unbreakable. Garrett Lawson had not only saved a life, but he had also found redemption for his own fractured soul. Meredith Carroll had lost an empire built on lies, but in its place, she had reclaimed her integrity, her humanity. And Wyatt, who had been robbed of his mother's presence far too soon, now stood on the precipice of a future built on truth, shielded by integrity. A future where those who dared to speak truth to power were not punished, but celebrated. Where courage was not a liability, but a virtue. And where even the most flawed heroes were sometimes granted a beautiful, improbable ending. If you remained with this story until the very last word, thank you, from the bottom of my heart. Stories like this serve as a potent reminder that courage resides not in grand pronouncements or heroic feats, but in the everyday choices of ordinary people. And that justice, even when delayed, is always worth fighting for. If you crave more deeply emotional, real-world narratives like this one, please subscribe, activate notifications, and join me on the next journey into the human heart. I'll see you in the next story.